The alarm blared 24 hours after the crime. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Where in the world are you uncovering this case from? Drop a comment below. I love seeing this community connect across continents. It was a bitterly cold morning in the waning days of February 1893, when I was roused from slumber by the singular sound of Holmes's violin. Slicing the chill from the parlor, the melody was brisk, relentless, and more agitated than usual, suggestive of a mind whirring with thoughts yet unspoken. I descended the stairs of our shared lodgings at 221B Baker Street, and found Holmes already fully dressed, standing by the hearth with the instrument under his chin, eyes fixed not on his strings, but on the morning edition of the Times, spread across the arm of the chair. "You're up early," I ventured, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Holmes stopped abruptly and turned toward me. "The city, Watson, has presented us with a paradox. A gentleman has been murdered, and the alarm meant to save him was sounded curiously a full day too late." He gestured toward the paper, and I stooped to read the headline: "Death of Banker in Kensington. Strange delay in ringer system." The article described the mysterious death of Mr. Edward Hartright, a discreet but respected financial advisor, who was found lifeless in his study at his home on Holland Park Avenue. The curious element, as Holmes noted, was that his estates, alarm beller private system wired to alert the local constable, had rung precisely 24 hours after the coroner determined the time of death. "It seems," Holmes said, pouring himself a cup of the Darjeeling Mrs. Hudson had left warming on the sideboard, "that either Mr. Hartright's alarm was shamefully defective, or someone went to considerable effort to delay its toll." I frowned. "And what cause of death was given?" "Poison," Holmes replied, specifically digitalis. "If the early report is to be believed, it appears our victim suffered no visible wounds. A subtle and efficient method of dispatch, most convenient for an assassin who prefers quiet over spectacle." He tossed the paper onto the table and began pacing. "There is more, Watson. A client is due here within the hour. Miss Evelyn Hartright, the niece of the deceased. She believes, most adamantly, that her uncle's death was not natural and that someone manipulated the alarm in order to ensure he was beyond saving. A delay of 24 hours. I mused aloud. That would suggest planning, not mere coincidence." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Just so. And the question becomes, was it mechanical sabotage or the work of a cunning hand, with access to both the estate and its inner workings?" I was about to respond when there was a sharp rap at the door. Holmes raised his brow in satisfaction. "Right on time. Come in, Miss Hartright." The door opened to admit a tall, well-dressed woman of perhaps 30 years, her face pale beneath a wide-brimmed hat adorned with a dark feather. She carried herself with the grace of good breeding, but also a tension that clung to her shoulders. "Like the London fog, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice firm but edged with urgency. "I thank you for receiving me. I fear I am at a loss and possibly in danger." Holmes offered her the chair opposite the hearth and gestured for me to pour her some tea. "You mentioned in your telegram that you found something unusual following your uncle's death." "Yes," she replied, accepting the cup with trembling fingers. It was his desk locked, though I know the key was always left in the drawer. When the constable opened it, they found his ledger undisturbed. But one paper had been burned hastily, I think, for the ash hadn't settled, and there was a smell of camphor in the air. Holmes leaned forward. Camphor? Curious. That is often used to mask stronger odors. Did you observe any bottles or vials nearby? No. Mr. Holmes, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Fuller, said that a man had come to the house 2 days prior to his death. She assumed he was a client. Though he was not known to her, he left no name. She said he wore gloves, even indoors, a sign of caution or disguise. Holmes murmured, "And what of the alarm?" "It was tested only last week," Miss Hartright said, and the constable Sergeant Dilling confirmed that the signal came through precisely 24 hours after my uncle would have needed it. It's as though the system waited until he was beyond help. Holmes sat back and steepled his fingers. "Miss Hartright, your instincts serve you well. The instrument of death may be poison, but the orchestration of its delivery is what interests me. You say the alarm was connected via wire to the station, yes. Installed 6 years ago after a break-in. Then it is not only the alarm we must investigate." Holmes said, "It is the wire, the bell, the timing, and most of all, the reason for a man's bell to ring after his soul has left him." He rose, eyes gleaming. "Come, Watson, we are bound for Holland Park Avenue, and I advise you, Miss Hartright, to remain here until we send for you. It may well be that your presence at your uncle's home will tip our hand too soon." She nodded gravely. "Whatever you require, Mr. Holmes. I only ask that you discover the truth and protect what remains of my family's name." As she departed, Holmes reached for his overcoat and cane. A banker is poisoned. An alarm rings a day late. A guest wears gloves indoors. There is a puzzle here, Watson, and I intend to untangle it before dusk. Thus began the case of the alarm that rang a day late, a crime so meticulously timed, even time itself had become a suspect. The morning had scarcely lifted the mist that clung to the rooftops as Holmes and I stepped into the hired cab and made our way through the slow, winding thoroughfares of West London. The air was damp and the light one, lending the city a spectral air, as if it, too, were holding its breath over the strange death in Holland Park Avenue. Holmes said little during the journey, his gaze fixed out the window, though I noticed his fingers drumming restlessly against his knee. Such a rhythm signified not nervousness, but calculation. I had come to know the signs. When we arrived, a constable was stationed at the wrought iron gate of the Hartright residence, a 3-story brick edifice flanked by narrow gardens and wrapped in ivy that curled like claws up the brickwork. Holmes introduced himself briskly and presented the card that Inspector Lestrade had once called his open sesame to every scene of consequence in the city. The constable, young and unsure of himself, nodded and waved us through with a slightly trembling hand. Inside, the house was still, as though the breath of its master had been exhaled and never drawn again. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fuller, a lean, pinched woman in black bombazine, met us in the vestibule and led us directly to the late Mr. Hartright's study. The scent of camphor still lingered faintly, as Miss Hartright had claimed, though beneath it lay something sharper, more acrid something that clung to the baseboards and curtain hems like an accusation. "This is where he was found," she said quietly, slumped at the desk. "The doctor said his heart had failed, but digitalis is quite persuasive in that respect," Holmes murmured. The study was well appointed, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and ledgers. A dark mahogany desk occupied the center of the room. On it sat a blotter, a dried fountain pen, and a brass desk lamp of antique design. Holmes moved with purpose, scanning the surface without touching anything. I took notes in my small pad, knowing better than to interrupt him once the scent of deduction was in the air. Double quotes Mrs. Fuller. Holmes said without turning, "You mentioned a visitor 2 days before your master's death. Describe him." She swallowed visibly. "A gentleman. Tall, foreign, perhaps his accent was clipped, though not quite German. He wore a dark coat, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat. Said he had an appointment." Mr. Hartright seemed uneasy after seeing him. Uneasy how? He drank a great deal more tea than usual after the man left, spent the evening writing letters. Or so I assumed. He wouldn't let me clear the desk until morning. Holmes's eyes flicked to the fireplace, and the following day he was found here. "Yes, sir." I knocked to deliver his breakfast. When he didn't answer, I found him there, just as you see the chair now, drawn up close. He was cold. "Did you touch anything?" I called the constable first, as he'd instructed in the case of emergency. Then I waited. I thought the bell had failed. Holmes walked to the far corner of the room and knelt by the skirting board. There, half concealed by a Persian rug, ran the wire the alarm line encased in a shallow wooden channel that hugged the wall. "Watson," he called. I stepped over. "Notice anything peculiar?" The casing had a smudge near where it met. The stone of the hearth, a pale smear, like grease or powder, as though something had been applied and then hastily wiped. Holmes sniffed it carefully, then drew out a small glass vial and dabbed it with a scrap of linen. Camphor mixed with resin, insulation material, possibly used by mechanics when tampering with electrical fittings. This channel has been pried open and resealed. Note the fresh scuff marks. But that would imply, I said slowly, that the wire was intentionally disconnected and then reconnected at a later time. Precisely. And unless our deceased had a habit of sabotaging his own means of rescue, someone else was here. Someone with knowledge of how and when to suppress a signal. It is not the murder that was so clever, Watson. It was the timing. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees. "Mrs. Fuller, who else had access to this room?" "No one, sir, but myself and the gardener, Mr. Larch, though he rarely came indoors. Summon him, if you please, and bring me a ladder." She looked puzzled but obeyed. Holmes crossed to the window and examined the latch, then pulled the drapes fully aside. "You see, Watson, there is more than one path to truth, but time is the only constant. We are dealing with a man who understood that time could be weaponized. Think of it. He kills a man, delays the alert by precisely 24 hours, and vanishes before anyone even knows the crime has occurred. And why the 24 hours? I asked. Why not longer or shorter? Because, Holmes replied, his tone sharpening. Any longer would draw suspicion to the alarm's failure. Any shorter, and the victim might have lived. The culprit knew exactly how long it would take for the poison to act, and precisely when the alarm would be needed. Therefore, he adjusted the signal accordingly. The housekeeper returned, Mr. Larch in tow. The man was sturdy, perhaps in his late 50s, with a complexion of sun-weathered brick and hands rough from pruning shears. I didn't touch nothing, he said at once. Never set foot in the study. Holmes looked him over. You wear gloves in your work, only when trimming thorns. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Yet you have a scratch on your left wrist fresh. No older than a day or two. Larch hesitated. Foxglove, he said at last. We've got some on the south lawn. I scraped myself pulling up weeds near it. Holmes's eyes brightened. Digitalis purpurea, a source of the poison used. Watson, mark that. I did. Were you aware that foxglove is lethal in even-minute quantities? Larch grew defensive. I ain't no murderer. I wouldn't know how to use it even if I wanted to. No, Holmes murmured, but someone else might. Someone who used your access, your proximity, and perhaps even your tools. He turned sharply. Mrs. Fuller. Have the locks been changed in the last year? No, sir. But Mr. Hartright kept the spare key to the study in his dressing table. Convenient, Holmes said. Now, about that ladder. She brought it, puzzled but obedient, and Holmes positioned it beside the study's grandfather clock. Ascending swiftly, he reached toward the cornice molding and withdrew a small object nestled in the shadow. It was a pocket chronometer, silver and ticking steadily. He held it aloft. Our saboteur was meticulous. I'd wager this was used to reset the alarm's internal mechanism. A manual delay inserted into the bell's release. That it remains here is not a mistake, it is arrogance. Descending, he wrapped it in a handkerchief and slipped it into his coat. We must trace the origin of this timepiece. It is unmonogrammed, but I know a man at Glendinning's who can tell us. Who had it serviced last? And then, I asked, then, we shall find the man whose business is not murder, but timing, and in doing so, we shall catch him in the very act of correcting his mistake. As we departed the study, I glanced back at the room, the ghost of the victim still heavy in the air. Holmes moved ahead with long strides, the glint of discovery already lighting his path. I could not yet see the shape of the truth, but Holmes, I knew, could already hear the clock striking the hour of justice. The fog had thickened by the time we stepped outside once more, cloaking Holland Park Avenue in a muffled hush, as though the street itself conspired to keep its secrets. Holmes lit a cigarette as we waited for a cab, his eyes distant, and though I remained silent beside him, I could see the cogs turning within his mind, shifting, aligning, evaluating. When at last we secured a hansom, he gave the driver the address of Glendinning's, the reputable watchmaker off Regent Street. You believe the timepiece will yield an owner? I asked as we rolled forward, the sound of the horses' hooves striking out a slow, rhythmic cadence on the cobbles. I believe, Watson, Holmes said, that the man who altered the alarm mechanism placed great confidence in the reliability of his instrument. To delay a signal by an exact duration requires precision. Precision demands quality. Quality is rare and often tracked by its craftsmen. If this chronometer was adjusted or serviced recently, we may obtain a name. We arrived shortly before noon, and Mr. Glendinning himself, a sprightly gentleman with a monocle and fingers like spider legs, greeted Holmes as an old acquaintance. Within moments, Holmes had the watch laid upon a velvet tray and had explained, with minimal embellishment, the nature of our inquiry. "Ah," said Glendinning, turning the piece over with reverent care. "Swiss movement, late 1880s. Not the sort you purchase from a catalogue. This was bespoke. See here, the tiny insignia. By the hinge, that is mine. I've serviced this one twice, both in the last year. Belongs to Mr. Adrian Tolliver, financier." Holmes's eyebrow arched. Adrian Tolliver, a name that keeps familiar company with coin and commission. Would you happen to know his address? Glendinning nodded, producing a leather ledger from beneath the counter, Charlotte Square. Number 6, outside once more. Holmes was quick to hail another cab. Charlotte Square lies at the edge of Kensington, near enough to walk to Hartright's residence. Too near to be coincidence. I watched him closely. You think Tolliver had reason to harm Mr. Hartright? Think, Watson, no. But I suspect which is far more dangerous. Tolliver's involvement suggests either a professional rivalry or a personal debt. Either could provoke the crime. But I want to observe the man before we approach him formally. The residence at number 6 Charlotte Square was a grand, white-fronted townhouse, imposing in its quiet elegance. Holmes did not announce our presence at once. Instead, we lingered across the street beneath a soot-streaked awning, peering discreetly through a break in the hedge. After 15 minutes, a man emerged, tall, severe in dress, his overcoat brushed and his boots polished to a lacquered sheen. He had a commanding stride and a trimmed mustache that gave him the look of a military man turned banker. "There he is," Holmes said. "Observe his left glove. Slightly stretched at the wrist, he wears a chronometer under it. No doubt the replacement for the one we found. But more interesting is the figure who trails him by 10 paces. I followed Holmes's gaze and spotted a second man nondescript, in a brown suit and cap, following with studied casualness. At a corner, Tolliver hailed a cab, unaware of his tail, and was gone. The second man paused, then turned into a tobacconist's without glancing back. Holmes stepped forward abruptly and entered the shop. I followed. The man was at the counter, purchasing a packet of cigarettes. When he turned and saw Holmes, a flicker of recognition passed across his face, immediately masked. Holmes approached him smoothly. "I should have known Scotland Yard would take an interest, though I must say your surveillance technique could use refinement." The man sighed and pocketed his purchase. "You've got me, Mr. Holmes." Detective Inspector Langley, transferred from Lambeth. I was told to keep An eye on Tolliver officially. On whose orders? Holmes asked. Langley glanced about, then dropped his voice. Lestrade. He doesn't like the smell of this business. Hartright was a cautious man. Too cautious to die without alarm. Lestrade thinks someone at the yard's been compromised. I'm the quiet inquiry. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then we share a common interest. Let us not trip over each other. Langley nodded and exited. Holmes waited until he had gone, then turned to me with a look of satisfaction. Watson, we now know 3 things. 1. Tolliver was recently near Hartright's property and had the means to manipulate the alarm. 2. Scotland Yard suspects internal tampering and trusts Tolliver little enough to trail him. 3. Our timeline is narrowing. The visit described by Mrs. Fuller fits Tolliver's appearance exactly. We returned to Baker Street shortly after 2 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson, ever intuitive, had already laid out sandwiches and hot tea. Holmes ignored both, retreating immediately to his armchair. Fingers pressed together, eyes closed. I ate in silence, content to wait. 20 minutes passed before he stirred. There is one person we have not yet heard from, the solicitor. The solicitor, I echoed. Yes, Hartright's affairs were extensive. He would have revised. His will regularly, especially in the weeks before his death, if he suspected danger. He rang the bell and had Mrs. Hudson bring Miss Hartright's card. Upon its back, she had scrawled the address of her uncle's solicitor, James Chittick, Esq, of Chittick and Morley. Temple Chambers. By 4 o'clock we were seated across from a thin, solemn man with the kind of voice that rarely rose above a murmur. His office was dim and lined with shelves bearing the weight of decades of confidential matters. Yes, Chittick said, removing a slim folio. Mr. Hartright revised his will 2 weeks prior to his death. The principal beneficiary is Miss Evelyn Hartright. The estate is substantial. Were there prior beneficiaries removed in this revision? Holmes asked. 1, Chittick said. A Mr. Adrian Tolliver, previously slated to receive a trust of £10,000. Holmes nodded slowly. Do you know why Mr. Hartright made this change? Chittick hesitated. He believed Tolliver had acted dishonestly in an investment venture. Something about forged returns. He said he would handle the matter quietly, without scandal, but he was adamant that Tolliver should not profit from his death. Then Tolliver had motive, I said. Not only motive, Holmes added, rising, but the means, the opportunity, and now the incentive to ensure the will could not be executed. Watson, the case has begun to speak. Back at Baker Street as twilight approached, Holmes resumed his pacing, each stride measured and precise. There is a final element missing, he said, a link between Tolliver and the foxglove. If he administered the poison directly, it must have come from somewhere, perhaps through Larch. Perhaps another means entirely. You don't think Larch was complicit? No, Holmes replied. He is no more than a gardener, but gardeners can be watched and their tools borrowed. At that moment, a knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, read, and smiled thinly. Watson, Tolliver has booked a ticket to Dover. Departure, midnight. Destination, Calais. He's running, not yet, Holmes said, snatching up his coat and cane. But he is beginning to feel the walls closing, and it is time we paid him a visit before he slips through our fingers like time itself. It was just after 6:30 when Holmes and I stepped out once more into the brisk London evening. The gas lamps flickered in their lanterns, casting narrow columns of light that failed to fully banish the darkness pooling in the gutters. The fog had thickened again, rising from the Thames like some great shroud drawn over the city, and Holmes pulled up the collar of his coat as we made our way toward Charlotte Square. For the second time that day, Tolliver has committed the cardinal error, Holmes said, his voice clipped, determined. He has mistaken precision for concealment, a crime timed to perfection. Watson is still a crime and timing can be traced. The house at number 6 was quiet. No light escaped the windows save a faint flicker in the upper study. Holmes knocked sharply, and a moment later a manservant answered. Blinking in surprise at the late hour and unexpected visitors, Mr. Tolliver is not receiving callers, he said stiffly. Holmes stepped forward and fixed him with the sort of stare that seemed to peel back layers of civility. Kindly inform Mr. Tolliver that Sherlock Holmes requests a brief audience concerning the late Edward Hartwright. He will want to hear what I have to say. The servant hesitated, then disappeared up the staircase. We waited in the grand entrance hall, polished oak floors, a marble bust of Cicero, and a grandfather clock ticking out its solemn metronome. Presently, the servant returned, clearly uncomfortable. He will see you in the study, gentlemen. We followed him upstairs and entered a dimly lit room smelling of leather and ink. Tolliver stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the other tucked behind his back. He was dressed impeccably, though his face bore the rigidness of a man who has been anticipating trouble. Mr. Holmes, he said coolly, I presume you're not here to discuss investments. No, Holmes replied, moving to the center of the room, though I suspect your financial ventures are at the very root of this visit. Tolliver's eyes narrowed. What precisely do you mean? I mean, Holmes said, that your presence at the late Mr. Hartwright's residence 2 days before his death, your recently serviced chronometer concealed within his study's cornice, and your impending departure for Calais all suggest a guilty conscience if not outright culpability. There was a pause, brief, but loaded with tension. Tolliver's jaw tightened. I see. This is to be an inquisition, then. Holmes turned, slowly examining the room. Hardly, but you may find it instructive. You see, I am not merely curious about why you chose to murder Edward Hartwright. I did no such thing. Tolliver snapped. Holmes went on as though he hadn't heard. But how you so precisely managed to delay the alarm system by exactly 24 hours. That is artistry of a kind, though not the sort that leaves no trace. You are making wild accusations, Tolliver said, stepping forward now. I had no reason to harm Edward. None. No? Holmes turned on his heel and met his eyes. You were removed from his will 2 weeks ago, cutting you off from a considerable sum. You visited him 2 days before his death, wearing gloves indoors. You tampered with the alarm wire inserting a mechanism controlled by your own pocket, chronometer, and your departure tonight, booked quietly and without notice, betrays a man aware that his scheme is unraveling. Tolliver's lips parted, as if to speak, but Holmes lifted a finger. Before you protest again, consider this. The foxglove used to poison Hartright grows not a mile from his home, and a gardener with no motive to kill was conveniently scratched. Days prior, you did not administer the poison with a glass. You contaminated his gloves. He always wore them while writing, did he not? A trace of powder digitalis in the fingertips. It absorbed into the skin as he worked late into the night, no doubt disturbed after your visit. By morning, it had done its work. Tolliver had turned ashen. This is all conjecture, is it? Holmes withdrew a handkerchief-wrapped bundle from his coat. Then perhaps you would care to explain why your initials are inscribed subtly on the inner rim of this timepiece casing. I had it examined this afternoon by the very man who serviced it last. Its presence hidden in Hartright's study would be difficult to explain, unless you planted it there. The silence stretched. Holmes stepped closer. The mechanism you installed paused the electrical signal by means of a small delay switch, crude but effective. It worked only once, delaying the bell by the precise interval needed to make Hartright's death appear natural, and the failure of the alarm a tragic malfunction. And it would have gone unnoticed had Miss Hartright not remembered the scent of camphor. Had your replacement watch not already been observed beneath your glove, and had you not been so eager to flee the country? Tolliver's composure began to crack. His breathing grew shallow, and he dropped into the nearest chair, burying his face in one hand. It was not meant to kill him, he muttered, only frighten him, make him reconsider. Holmes said nothing. Tolliver looked up, hollow-eyed. I did go to see him. I needed him to reinstate my trust. He threatened to go public, said he'd expose my miscalculations. I was ruined. I wanted to frighten him, just enough to regain control. But when he died, you ensured no one would help him, Holmes said flatly. You chose 24 hours so the alarm would still trigger, thus preserving the illusion of function. That is not fright. That is finality. Tolliver's voice broke. I only meant to scare him. You meant to silence him, Holmes replied, and you did. I stepped forward. Holmes, what now? The law. Holmes turned. The yard already has eyes on him. Langley won't have far to look. But I want one last thing before we leave. He walked over to the desk and pulled open a drawer. From it he retrieved a thin notebook, Hartright's ledger. He flipped it open, studying the last entries. Ah, he said, as I thought. He was preparing to report Tolliver's forgeries to the Board of Trustees. He had the meeting scheduled for the very day after his death. Holmes looked at Tolliver one last time, his gaze void of pity. You killed not out of passion, but calculation, and you erred only in assuming the hour of death would pass unnoticed by those who understand the rhythm of time. Outside, the fog had begun to lift ever so slightly, the first stars poking through the shifting veil overhead. We walked in silence until we reached the corner. Then Holmes spoke, his tone measured and remote. Time Watson. We count it in seconds and squander it in years. But Tolliver learned, as many do too late, that even a single day can betray a man. I said nothing. There was nothing to add. Holmes turned up his collar against the chill. Come. There is still the matter of Miss Hartwright. She will want to know that her instincts were correct and that her uncle, at least, can rest without unanswered questions. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the hour was approaching 10, and a low wind had begun to moan down the chimney like some plaintive spirit robbed of rest. Holmes removed his coat with mechanical precision and cast it onto the settee. Without a word, he moved to the sideboard, poured himself a measure of brandy, and stood motionless, staring into the fire as though sifting the embers for answers not yet spoken aloud. I said nothing for several minutes. The weight of the evening still pressed heavily on my mind. The confrontation with Tolliver had not merely exposed guilt. It had laid bare the cold efficiency of a man who believed his intellect might outrun justice. Yet I knew Holmes was not entirely satisfied. His silence was not that of triumph, it was that of deliberation. At last he spoke, his voice low, almost musing. We have enough to secure a conviction, Watson. The evidence, though circumstantial, in part, fits too tightly to unravel. Yet something about the execution still troubles me. I set down my teacup. You mean Tolliver's final words, in part. His insistence that he meant only to frighten Hartwright struck me as an incomplete truth. It lacked conviction, not in the legal sense, but the personal. The panic was real, but the remorse felt oddly directed, as though the consequences surprised him, but not the death itself. I frowned. You believe there's more behind it? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that the plan may not have been entirely of his making. There was a knock at the door before I could respond, sharp and anxious. Mrs. Hudson answered it, and moments later, Miss Evelyn Hartwright was shown in. She looked pale, but composed, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. I received your note, she said, her voice taut. You asked me to come immediately. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you for doing so, Miss Hartwright. Please, sit. She did not. You wrote that the man responsible for my uncle's death has been identified. Yes, Holmes said, and he is now under quiet observation by Scotland Yard. There will be no escape. She let out a slow breath, shoulders slackening slightly. Tolliver, I had begun to suspect it. Your suspicions served you well, Holmes said. It was your recollection of the camphor scent, and your resolve to act on intuition, that led us down the correct path. However, he paused. There is something more you must understand. Your uncle's death was planned meticulously, but the methodology suggests another hand may have been involved. Tolliver may not have acted alone, her brow furrowed. Another, who, that, Holmes said, remains unclear. But consider this. The mechanism used to delay the alarm signal was sophisticated. Though not beyond the talents of a capable amateur, yet there is reason to believe it was not designed by Tolliver himself. He had access and motive, but perhaps not the technical ingenuity. She looked shaken. Are you saying he had help? But who? Holmes walked to his desk, drew out a thin dossier, and handed her a sheet. I retrieved your uncle's recent correspondence from the solicitor. There are references to missing funds irregularities in Hartright's portfolio, traced to a separate account he did not recognize. That account was managed jointly, under a proxy, by an assistant in his banking office. One Charles Finley. She stared at the name. Finley, but he was so ordinary. I remember him. Quiet, dull, even. Exactly, Holmes said. Men who pass unnoticed are often the most dangerous. He would have known the details of the estate's alarm installation, access protocols, even when Hartright tended to work late and alone. I leaned forward. Then it's possible Finley built the device or sourced it, Holmes replied. Tolliver may have recruited him, or he may have simply exploited a system Finley had already corrupted. Either way, the timing and technical precision point to someone with knowledge of both mechanical delay mechanisms and electrical routing. Hartright's notes mentioned an appointment with a CF just 2 days before his death. Miss Hartright had turned pale again. I can't believe I never noticed. Do not reproach yourself, Holmes said gently. The men who deal in subterfuge often prefer to operate through the blind spots of others. Your strength was in refusing to accept the convenient explanation. She stood and paced a few steps, collecting herself. What can be done if Finley's still at large? He won't be for long, Holmes said. I've already wired Inspector Lestrade with my findings. If Finley is indeed complicit, we shall have him by morning. She nodded slowly. My uncle trusted too easily. But I shall not rest until every part of this scheme is brought to light. Holmes studied her for a moment, then said, Miss Hartright, when this is over, you will inherit more than your uncle's estate. You will inherit the responsibility of ensuring his name is remembered justly. That, I suspect, you are quite suited to. She gave a small smile, the first we had seen. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. After she left, silence settled over the room once more. Holmes returned to the window, staring into the mist. I refilled my teacup, watching him. You suspected Finley all along? No, Holmes said. But the absence of anyone else to blame sharpened the edges of the truth. When too much fits too easily, one must look for the gap. He turned, suddenly animated. Come, Watson, we are not finished yet. If Finley is the linchpin, then there must be evidence records, letters, drafts of the mechanism, something to confirm it. I intend to find it. To where? I asked, standing. To the offices of Hartright and Tolliver, tonight. But they'll be closed. Holmes's smile was thin. Closed to the public. But we are not the public. We gathered our coats once more and vanished into the fog. The game, as ever, was afoot-hand this time. The hands that had set the clock running had yet to realize that their time was nearly up. The city seemed to draw its coat of fog tighter about itself as we made our way through the quiet streets toward Lombard Lane, where the discreet brass plaque of Hartright and Tolliver, financial advisement, sat unassumingly above a double-doored entrance. The hour was late, well past 11, but Holmes moved with the swift precision of a man who had already traced the line from suspicion to fact and merely required confirmation. The street was empty, save for the rhythmic echo of our steps and the occasional clatter of a distant hansom fading into the gloom. Holmes produced a slender instrument from within his coat and had the lock turned within seconds. "The simplicity of these city office locks," he murmured, "continues to disappoint." The interior was dark, but Holmes declined the use of a lamp. He moved confidently, guided by memory, while I followed close behind, one hand brushing the wall for bearings. We passed through the front offices and turned left into a narrower corridor, where Holmes stopped before a frosted glass door labeled "Private, Mr. C. Finley." He glanced at me once and then tried the handle. It did not yield. "A commendable show of discretion, Mr. Finley," Holmes whispered, "but not quite enough." With the same practiced ease, he applied his tool again, and this time the door opened with a soft click. Inside, the scent of ink and brass lingered in the still air. A bank of filing cabinets stood beneath a tall window, their shadows long and angular in the moonlight. Holmes stepped to the desk and began to search. Each drawer opened and closed with surgical economy. I moved to the bookcase and began scanning the spines. Most were accounting manuals and ledgers, but one volume appeared unusually deep in the shelf. I tugged at it and found it hollow. Inside was a narrow envelope, folded lengthwise and sealed with red wax. "Holmes," I called. He turned instantly and crossed to me. I handed him the envelope, and he broke the seal carefully. Inside were 4 pages of diagrams, meticulously drawn, with annotations in a precise, slanted hand. "Look here," he said, spreading them on the desk. "Electrical delay mechanisms, modifications to existing bell systems, even notations on insulation material, resin, and camphor. This is the blueprint for the sabotage we found in Hartright's study." "But why would he keep it?" I asked. "Because Finley was not merely an accomplice, Watson, he was an opportunist. He may have intended to blackmail Tolliver later, or perhaps preserve the work as insurance. These men who trade in risk often cannot resist holding an ace in reserve." He turned to the final page, and his brow furrowed. "Now this is interesting." I leaned in. "A name, not exactly, but a reference to a second device, tested, HP system, the 17th of January, duplicate reserved at safe house." This suggests he had already applied his technique to another location. Hartright's alarm was not the only one he manipulated. A chill passed through me. "Then someone else may be in danger. Possibly," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. "Or Finley meant to demonstrate his talents more broadly. He could have used Hartright as a trial run." We returned the documents to the envelope, which Holmes tucked into his coat. Then he swept the room with one last glance. "There's nothing else here of consequence. Come, we must alert Lestrade at once. If Finley has another site prepared, we may yet forestall its use." We exited the building with the same silence with which we entered. The air had grown colder, the fog thinning into low-hanging ribbons that drifted between gas lamps like the last shreds of a dream. At the first corner, Holmes flagged down a cab and gave directions to Scotland Yard. Lestrade was still awake. Holmes had wired ahead before we left Baker Street, and the inspector received us without delay in a back room thick with tobacco smoke and the scratch of fountain pens. "You have something concrete?" then Lestrade asked, as Holmes placed the envelope on the desk. Holmes nodded. "Blueprints and technical instructions matching the device used to delay Hartright's alarm. Annotations suggest Finlay not only built the mechanism, but experimented with a second unit." Lestrade's face darkened as he studied the pages. "If this is accurate, then we've a dangerous man indeed, and a calculating one. Have you detained Tolliver?" "As of an hour ago, my men took him from his home without incident. He folded rather quickly, though, he claimed. The alarm device was supplied to him by another party, as he put it." "Finlay," I said. "Almost certainly," Holmes added. "But we must move fast. The notation of a safe house may refer to a secondary office or even a residence. Do you have any known addresses for Finlay?" Lestrade flipped open a file and read, "Finlay resides at a small let on Rosamund Street, quiet block, near Paddington." Holmes was already rising. "Then we must go there at once. This man planned one murder and hinted at another. Whether for profit or practice, we cannot afford to wait for the bell to ring again." Within 20 minutes, we stood outside a narrow brick townhouse on Rosamund Street. The building was quiet, windows dark. Lestrade motioned to his constables, who took position at the rear while he, Holmes, and I approached the door. Lestrade rapped sharply. "No answer." He knocked again, louder. "Still nothing." Holmes stepped forward, knelt to inspect the keyhole, and then straightened. "No recent use. Dust undisturbed. The man is not here." Lestrade tried the knob. "Locked. Break it," he ordered. The constable stepped forward and forced it open with his shoulder. The door splintered, and we entered. Flashlamps sweeping across furniture shrouded in dust covers. The house smelled of old paper and metal polish. We moved room by room, Holmes with feline precision, Lestrade with methodical caution, until we reached the second-floor study. "Here," Holmes said. It was unmistakably Finlay's workspace. A drafting table littered with mechanical drawings stood beneath the window. Along one wall, a heavy cabinet, half open, revealed spools of copper wire, small soldering irons, and a jar of resin. Holmes rifled through the desk until he found a bound notebook. Inside, dates, schematics, and a list of names, half a dozen in all. "Watson," he said, holding it up. "This confirms it. Finlay was planning a series of installations, all tied to the same mechanism. He wasn't simply helping Tolliver, he was developing a business in delay." A business? Imagine it. A man who could discreetly alter a signal system alarm, bell, or buzzer for anyone with a need for secrecy. A crooked financier, a blackmailer, even a murderer. The delay becomes a shield. Lestrade took the notebook grimly. "He's been selling time." Holmes turned toward the window. "And time, as ever, is what we have least of. We must find him, Lestrade, tonight, from downstairs." A sudden commotion, boots on wood, a cry of alarm. A constable burst in. "Sir, back alley, someone fled through the garden. We've lost him in the fog." Holmes spun and raced down the stairs. the rest of us behind him. But by the time we reached the rear yard, only the cold night air remained. A gate stood ajar, its iron hinges swinging gently. No trace of Finlay, no shadow, no footfall. Gone. Holmes stared into the dark. Jaw set. "The second man," he said softly. "The one Tolliver thought he could control, but never truly understood. He's out there. Watson, and now he knows we are looking." We stood for a moment in the fog-drenched garden behind Finlay's lodgings, the faint clang of the back gate still echoing in the distance. Holmes scanned the perimeter with swift, hawk-like precision. A broken branch on the hedge, a dark smear along the brick wall, and a set of half-formed shoe impressions in the patch of turned soil near the fence were all that remained of the man we had nearly caught. "He was watching us," Holmes murmured. "Somewhere close by, possibly even within earshot while we were upstairs. He heard us coming, waited until we'd moved beyond the lower floor, and slipped out like a wisp of smoke." Lestrade swore softly behind us. "He can't have gone far. I've got men posted at both ends of the street." Holmes turned to him with unusual sharpness. "If Finlay is half as clever as I suspect, he's already changed direction twice and discarded anything that might identify him. You'll catch nothing with a net spread after the fish has bolted." He strode back into the house, gesturing for us to follow. "We've lost the man, yes, but not the meaning behind what he left behind. There's still time to turn this game before he sets the board again." Back in the study, Holmes returned to the desk with single-minded focus. "Watson," he said, "look here." He pointed to the list of names in Finlay's notebook, 6 in total, each with a code beside it, either A or D. Only Hartright's name bore the initial A. The rest had DA for active, I said, catching on, and D for deferred or deployed. Holmes corrected. "It's a log of clients, or rather victims, who had delay mechanisms installed or planned. Hartright's alarm had been sabotaged and used, hence the A. These others." He flipped through the pages quickly. "Yes, look here, this entry references an address in Belgravia. The initials match a GM, Jeffrey Milbank, a known name in city investment circles. If Finlay tampered with his security system, and he's not yet acted, he may intend another strike." I finished. "Exactly. Finlay fled because we uncovered too much, too quickly. But the list tells us his timetable isn't complete. He had other targets, and that gives us our next step." Lestrade leaned over Holmes's shoulder. "Milbank's a slippery sort. Bit of a rogue, if you believe the gossip, but no known charges. Still, he's connected, which is precisely why he'd attract Finlay's interest," Holmes said. "His associates, his enemies, any number of them, could have commissioned a delay device without the target's knowledge." Lestrade straightened. "I'll dispatch someone to watch the house tonight." "No," Holmes said firmly. "That won't do. Finlay may already be inside. If the device is in place, we cannot risk it being triggered. We go ourselves." Within the hour, we arrived at the Milbank residence, an imposing structure of red brick, gas lamps flanking the tall iron gate. It loomed quietly over a narrow square of empty road. The kind of house that drew attention for its grandeur, but remained curiously unreadable behind shuttered windows. Milbank himself answered the door. He was a man in his late 50s, well-groomed, with the flushed complexion of someone fond of burgundy and little exertion. His face hardened when Holmes introduced himself. "I'm not in the habit of entertaining visitors at this hour, Mr. Holmes." Nevertheless, Holmes said, stepping past him with the kind of command that tolerated no rebuttal. "This is not a social call. Your life may depend upon the interruption." Milbank blinked, then closed the door behind us. "What the devil are you talking about?" Holmes turned to him. "You recently had your alarm system rewired. You were told it would reduce false triggers, perhaps remove an irritant or streamline its function. Isn't that so?" Milbank hesitated. "Yes. One of the junior men at my firm recommended a specialist, quiet sort, Charles Finlay. I think Finlay installed a delay mechanism in your system," Holmes said bluntly. "A similar device was used in the recent murder of Edward Hartwright. We believe your alarm was next on his list and that either you or someone connected to you is in danger." Milbank had gone pale. "My God!" Holmes moved swiftly through the entrance hall toward the alarm panel. Mounted discreetly beside the main staircase, he examined the wires with a practiced hand, then removed the panel cover entirely. Inside, nestled between the connections, was a compact brass unit. He pulled it free gently, holding it between thumb and forefinger. "Still active," he murmured. This device was waiting to be used. The question now is, by whom? Milbank looked on, stricken. "I've made enemies, yes, but none I imagined would go so far." "Then it is likely someone in your own house or very near to it," Holmes replied. "Finlay rarely acted alone. He built systems for others, for clients who wanted plausible deniability. We need to know who gave him your name." Milbank rubbed his temples. 2 days ago, I hosted a dinner. 8 guests, investors, clients, an old friend from university. I can give you the list. "Do so immediately," Holmes said, "and none of them are to be contacted. If Finlay's clients suspect we are closing in, they will cut him loose or worse." Force his hand early, as Milbank disappeared upstairs. To retrieve the guest list, Holmes turned to Lestrade and me. "The list will help, but we must consider Finlay's next step. He fled without resources, but he won't vanish. He needs money, protection, perhaps even revenge. If he learns that the sabotage at Milbank's house has been uncovered, he may grow desperate. He'll try to finish the job," I asked, "or bargain with one of his remaining clients. But desperation breeds sloppiness. He will leave a trace." Milbank returned with the list, and Holmes scanned the names rapidly. His eyes paused halfway down. "Interesting," he said. "Basil Endicott, a solicitor who once represented Tolliver's firm. And look at this Reginald Chase, formerly employed at Hartwright's offices. Finlay had connections to both. I believe we've found our link." Lestrade took the list. "We'll put a tail on both of them." "No," Holmes said. "We split the trail. You take Endicott. Watson and I will pay a visit to Mr. Chase. The fog had not lifted, and the streets now lay deserted but for the occasional drunkard hurrying home. As we made our way to the modest residence of Reginald Chase in South Kensington, I felt the weight of the night tighten around us. Holmes walked beside me, silent but keen-eyed. "He'll know we're coming," I said. "Not unless he's heard from Finlay," Holmes replied, "and if Finlay had time to warn his allies, he wouldn't have left his devices behind." We reached Chase's house just past 1 in the morning. A light was still burning upstairs. Holmes knocked. Moments later, the door opened. Reginald Chase stood in his dressing gown, surprise etched across his face. "Mr. Holmes." "Good evening," Holmes said, stepping forward. "We've questions that require answers about Mr. Finlay, about Hartright, and about your part in all of it." Chase's eyes darted sideways. I don't know what you mean." Holmes's hand shot out, grabbing the man by the wrist. "Then you won't mind if we step inside." Chase resisted a fraction. "Too long." That was enough. Holmes pulled him forward, revealing the glint of a revolver half concealed behind the doorframe. With practiced speed, he knocked it free. "You've made your choice," Holmes said coldly, "and you'll answer for it." Chase sagged under the grip, defeated. Holmes looked to me. "We've caught the voice behind Finlay's work. The man who ordered the delay, the one who promised him protection." And as we led Chase inside, I realized the truth Holmes had seen before any of us. That Finlay had not been the master of the game, but its instrument. The hand that wound the clock had finally been exposed. The interior of Reginald Chase's home bore the uneasy odor of a man who lived alone, and had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. Papers were stacked in symmetrical piles on every available surface. A clock ticked loudly from the mantel, and a tray of untouched tea sat cooling on a sideboard, forgotten. As we entered, Holmes gave the room a cursory glance, already gauging what it revealed and what it concealed. "Sit down," he instructed sharply, and Chase, still pale and trembling from Holmes's disarming of the revolver, sank into an armchair with the stiffness of a man awaiting judgment. I took a position near the door to block any sudden movements. Though the man looked more likely to faint than flee, Holmes began pacing. "You were the voice behind Finlay, the one who supplied him with names, funds, and legitimacy. You kept him on retainer and sent him into respectable households under the guise of an advisor, an electrician, a harmless technician. You brokered delay, Mr. Chase. You sold time to those who had none left." Chase swallowed. "You have no proof of that?" Holmes turned sharply and pulled the folded notebook from his coat. "On the contrary, Finlay kept meticulous records. Your name appears not once, but 3 times, each associated with initials from separate clients. One of them is Hartright. Another is Milbank." Chase's lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. Holmes went on. "You arranged for Finlay to sabotage Hartright's alarm under Tolliver's instructions. Then you recommended Finlay to Milbank's firm, knowing full well that someone else would seize the opportunity, or that you might. Either way, you remained insulated, untouched, the respectable middleman. I didn't order anyone's death," Chase muttered. No, Holmes agreed coolly. You merely made it possible. You provided introductions, guaranteed discretion, and profited from every transaction. You left Finlay to do the messy work, and when it began to go wrong, you waited, hoping he would either succeed or vanish. Chase's gaze dropped to the floor. He had the look of a man who had long since reconciled himself to his own moral erosion, but only now felt the cold of it. Finlay said you were growing reckless. Holmes continued. He noted in his ledger that you spoke of shortening the chain. You feared exposure by Hartright, perhaps, or Tolliver after the inheritance failed to materialize. So you ordered Finlay to accelerate the schedule. He was losing control, Chase muttered. Barely audible. Holmes stopped pacing. On the contrary, it was you who lost control. You believed you could command cleverness and compromise without consequence, that others would absorb the guilt while you remained untouchable. I never wanted blood, Chase said, and for the first time there was something like sincerity in his voice. I only saw how eager people were to buy silence, delay, deniability. I thought if I didn't ask questions, if I simply arranged things, I wouldn't be responsible. Holmes's voice was sharp. A man who sells the trigger cannot disavow the bullet. There was a knock at the door. I opened it to admit Lestrade, flanked by two constables. Holmes had signaled ahead by telegram as we approached Chase's residence, and the yard had moved quickly. One glance at the subdued, slumping figure in the chair was enough for Lestrade to take control of the situation. Chase offered no resistance as the cuffs were fastened. He only looked up once, briefly, as Holmes addressed him one last time. You thought time could be bent to your profit, that delay itself might be sold like a commodity. But time, Mr. Chase, has never yet spared the guilty. Lestrade nodded. Grimly, we'll take it from here. As the door closed behind them, the silence that followed seemed curiously hollow. The night had grown quieter, still fogged, but with the weight of motion lifting, like a storm that had exhausted itself. Holmes stood at the window for a moment, watching the constables disappear into the dark. You were right, I said at last. Finlay was the hand, but Chase was the mind, the machine behind the machine. Holmes nodded. Chase dealt in moral leverage. He built a network of complicity, insulated himself through layers of technicality and delegation. But in the end, he could not control the consequences. We stepped back out into the damp stillness of the early morning. The gas lamps hissed faintly in the distance, and the streets were still empty. Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling like ghosts into the mist. Do you think we've seen the last of Finlay? I asked. For now, Holmes said. He will run. Men like him always do. But he will leave traces, contacts, money trails, perhaps an overreaching message to a past client. We have the advantage now. His network is shattered, his partner rested. He has lost both anchor and purpose. Still, I said, it unnerves me knowing he's out there, capable of so much. Holmes turned to me, his expression shadowed. It should unnerve you, Watson, not because of Finlay's skill, but because of the ease with which he was used. Because there will always be men like Chase, men who believe consequence ends at the edge of their fingertips. We returned to Baker Street just before dawn. The city was stirring at last, slow wagons rolling over cobbles, milkmen rattling bottles, a newspaper boy whizzing into the fog. Holmes went straight to the fire and poured himself a stiff brandy without a word. I joined him by the hearth, exhaustion beginning to press upon my limbs. "You've solved the case, Holmes. It's over." He did not answer at once. He stood, eyes on the fire, as though watching time itself flicker and die across the embers. "It is concluded," he said finally, "but it is never over, Watson. Not truly. As long as men place profit over principle, there will always be someone willing to delay the bell." And with that, he turned, sat, and picked up his violin. The first notes were low, almost mournful, a slow, contemplative air that hung in the air like mist, refusing to resolve. I listened in silence, knowing that, though this particular case had ended, the work of Sherlock Holmes never truly did. There would be more puzzles, more shadows, and more men like Finlay and Chase. But for tonight, at least, time had not been cheated. The bell had rung, and it had rung in time. The pale light of morning was just beginning to filter through the gauze of the London fog as I sat at the writing desk in our sitting room at Baker Street, trying to organize my notes from the night's events. I could still hear Holmes's violin from the corner, its melody now slower and subdued, drifting listlessly as if even the strings themselves had grown weary. He hadn't spoken since the early hours when we returned. There was something about the resolution of the case, its jagged edges and moral ambiguity, that had not sat easily with him, and I could not blame him. It had been a case not of brutality in the traditional sense, but of calculation. Delay used as a weapon, complicity hidden beneath civility. It left no blood on the floor, but was no less cruel. Just as I set down my pen, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a small silver tray. "Another message from Scotland Yard, I believe," she said, her voice cautious. "Inspector Lestrade sent it not 10 minutes ago." Holmes did not move, so I stood and crossed the room, opening the envelope with practiced fingers. The message was terse, written in Lestrade's tight scrawl, Chase refusing to cooperate, nitrogen monoxide confession, Finlay still at large, suggested you review safe house ledger. Again, new name may be embedded in notes. I read the message aloud. Holmes stopped playing. His bow lingered in the air, the final note suspended for a breath longer than necessary. "Of course he refuses," Holmes said finally, lowering the violin. "Chase fancies himself untouchable. To the last, he still believes silence buys leverage. He knows that Finlay's disappearance gives him value, even in custody. But Lestrade believes there may be more in Finlay's notes." I said, "Perhaps another client, one we missed." Holmes nodded, standing. "Then we shall not rest until we know every name he dealt with. If Finlay had reason to run when he did, if he fled not simply out of fear, but because another job was scheduled, then we are not finished. Not yet." He crossed the room to his desk and retrieved the slim notebook we had taken from Finlay's study. He laid it flat and began to flip through its pages, his eyes moving with almost mechanical precision. I leaned over his shoulder, watching most of the names and coded initials we had already examined. Hartright, Milbank, a man called A.G. in Finchley, and two more who were already under observation. But now, Holmes lingered on a page we had previously glanced over, where the handwriting was more hurried, annotations cluttered into the margin. "What do you see?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He pointed to a faint set of characters, penciled along the side. R.S., the 19th of February urgent. R.S., he murmured. The only set of initials unconnected to any address or client we've identified. I frowned. And the 19th, that's today. Holmes looked up, eyes sharp. Finlay had scheduled another job. Something urgent, set for this very day. And whoever R.S. is, they were his next target. I pulled out my own notes, scanning them. We have no R.S. on Milbank's guest list or among Chase's known associates. Holmes tapped the table. It's to rushed, to discreet, whoever R.S. is. They may not have approached Finlay through Chase. It may be a private arrangement, a commission outside the main chain. Finlay was preparing to go independent cut out his handlers. This may have been his first solo job. He stood abruptly. We must find R.S. if we can identify the client. We may intercept the act. But where do we begin? I asked. Holmes stared into space for a moment, then snapped his fingers. Letters. We passed over a small bundle of correspondence. In Finlay's safe house desk, remember, tied with blue string. We assumed them to be receipts. But he wouldn't have listed clients in a ledger and corresponded with them through coded initials. If R.S. was important, Finlay may have kept direct communication. Within minutes, we were out the door again, the air brisk and sharp. It was still early, and the streets were not yet fully alive, save for the occasional baker or lamplighter moving through their morning routines. The constables at Finlay's safe house recognized us and let us in without question. Holmes strode directly to the desk and pulled open the drawer where the letters had been stored. He untied the string, fanned them across the table, and scanned each one quickly. "This one," he said, pulling out a single envelope. "No return address. Postmarked only yesterday. Initials R.S. at the bottom." I took the letter and read aloud. "The delay is critical. It must occur precisely between noon and 1. They must not be reached before the meeting concludes. The system is accessible via the side entrance. Payment as agreed." R.S. Holmes's face grew still. Not murder, this time. Interruption, obstruction. But who? He held out his hand. "Let me see the envelope." He turned it over, examined the stamp under his magnifying glass, and smiled coldly. "The adhesive has left faint residue. Traces of gum tragacanthrae, used only in certain imported envelope brands. This was sold by Trillman Stationery on Grafton Street. If we're lucky, the clerk will remember who purchased it. We were there within half an hour. The clerk, a helpful young woman with a memory for faces, nodded at the description Holmes gave. "Yes, I sold that brand 2 days ago. Gentleman in a blue overcoat. Asked for writing paper and envelope same stamp design. Paid in cash. He gave his name for the receipt. Mr. Silas Rowntree. Holmes turned to me, his expression alert. R.S. Rowntree. Silas. Do you know him? I do now, Holmes said. He's a legal clerk at Tolland and Bates. But, more importantly, he's scheduled to appear today before a banking arbitration tribunal representing a client accused of forgery. A verdict hinges on an eyewitness who is due to arrive precisely at noon. That delay Finlay mentioned it was never about murder. It was about prevention, to prevent the witness from arriving. Exactly, Rowntree planned to delay the alarm system in the tribunal office, ensuring the entry to the chamber would be blocked or redirected long enough to prevent the witness from testifying, possibly by a staged fire alert or a triggered lockdown. Just 1 hour would be enough. Holmes checked his watch. It's already past 10. We have little time. We moved quickly. At the tribunal building, Holmes presented his credentials and demanded immediate access to the building superintendent. Within moments, he had located the alarm system and, with a thin smile, uncovered the telltale signs of tampering. A small brass loop inserted behind the main panel. Finlay's signature, delay device. Holmes removed it carefully and handed it to the stunned official. Ensure no one touches this again. At precisely 12:15, the key witness arrived and was admitted without obstruction. The case concluded as scheduled, and the client Rowntree represented was convicted. Only then, once the corridors had cleared and the building had quieted, did Holmes allow himself a rare sigh of satisfaction. Finlay has not yet vanished, Watson, he said, but his web has begun to collapse. Chase is in custody. Rowntree has revealed himself, and with each pulled thread, the whole fragile weave begins to fray. Do you believe we'll catch him? I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer immediately. He looked out the tall tribunal window, watching the fog swirl around the domes and steeples of the city. We'll catch him, he said at last, because Finlay's greatest flaw is his confidence. He believes himself unseen. But now the city is looking for him. And London, he added with a faint smile, does not forget. And with that, we stepped once more into the grey chill. The sound of bells echoing faintly across the rooftops, this time ringing not for delay, but for justice. Moving forward at last. By the following morning, a heavy rain had swept in from the west, washing the soot from the rooftops and lending the city an oddly refreshed appearance, as if London itself had drawn a deep breath and let it out. Holmes and I sat in the warm interior of Baker Street once more, the fire crackling cheerfully, but there was no sense of conclusion in the air. Though Rowntree had been arrested following the tribunal's disruption attempt thanks in part to Holmes's timely intervention, the man had said nothing of Finlay. No contacts, no messages, no trail. He is still several moves ahead, Holmes said, peering into his teacup with that peculiar expression of introspection that often masked his agitation. Every client we uncover is one step behind the man himself. Chase was a partner, Rowntree, a tool, but Finlay, he is something different. You believe he was planning more? I asked. I know it, Holmes said. You observed it yourself. His notes were not merely transactional. They were evolving. He began as an instrument of sabotage for others, but by the end, he was crafting schemes of his own. Rountree's plot was not in Chase's ledger. That tells us Finlay had started to act independently, and that means he was no longer just an accomplice. He was becoming a power. He stood suddenly and moved to the cluttered side table, sorting through a stack of correspondence. And like all men who consider themselves indispensable, he would have left behind something, a backup, a fail-safe. There is no way Finlay didn't prepare for a day like this. Where would he go? I asked. The safe house is compromised. His network is dissolving. He cannot hide in plain sight. No, Holmes agreed. But he may try to leverage what remains. These men often mistake disappearance for safety. In truth, vanishing makes them vulnerable because it limits their reach. He will want to strike once more, boldly, to reassert control. And if he does, a sharp knock interrupted him. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, her expression faintly troubled. "There's a man downstairs, Mr. Holmes. Says he's a messenger from the Rochester Telegraph Office. But he's insistent won't leave the message. Says it must be given to you directly." Holmes's brow furrowed. Rochester. Without hesitation, he moved to the stairwell, and I followed close behind. A lean, rain-dampened man stood in the foyer, his coat spattered with road dust, his cap tucked respectfully beneath his arm. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, voice clipped. Holmes nodded. "Yes." The man produced a folded envelope. "Was given this by a man outside the station, sir. Said it was urgent. Paid me a sovereign to bring it directly to you." Holmes took the note, opened it, and read silently. His eyes did not move much, no scanning, no rereading, a single message. Brief. Then he looked up, and I saw the light of decision already blooming behind his eyes. "He's baiting us," he said softly. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes passed it to me. It read, "You stopped one bell, but can you hear the next? No delay this time. 3 p.m. New Thames Shipping Office, South Dock. Let's see if time is really on your side. F." I stared at the page. He's planning another event. Holmes was already pulling on his coat, or threatening one. But either way, he is drawing us to South Dock. It is both a challenge and a test, a final move. And we have only hours. The journey through the wet streets was a silent one. Holmes sat forward, chin tucked into his scarf, his thoughts moving too quickly for speech. It was just after 1 o'clock when we arrived at the riverfront, where the grey sky pressed down against the cranes and brick warehouses of the South Dock district. The Thames, swollen from the recent rains, lapped heavily at its banks. The New Thames Shipping Office stood alone at the end of a narrow quay, a 3-story brick structure, with boarded windows on the upper floor and a rusting nameplate affixed just above the door. It had once housed a bustling clerk's operation, but now the lower floor was used only for record storage. Lestrade was already there with 2 men from the yard, summoned by Holmes's earlier telegram. They stood huddled beneath an overhang, sheltering from the steady drizzle. "Another letter?" Lestrade asked, brows raised. Holmes nodded, this time with a time and place. A showman's trick, but I believe Finley is serious. We are to find something here, or fail. The constables pushed open the door. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Old crates and shelving lined the walls. A narrow stair led upward to the closed-off upper floors. Holmes moved immediately toward the far wall, where a brass bell mechanism protruded from the paneling part of an outdated internal communication system. "Watson, the bell," he said. I examined it. "Wired but disconnected. Corroded." He nodded. "Then it's not the literal bell. It's symbolic." He turned, scanning the room. Then he froze. "Here," he said, striding to a desk half hidden behind stacked crates. Upon it lay a square parcel, wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. Holmes unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small metal box, clockwork ticking faintly from within. He did not touch the dial. Instead, he turned the box gently and examined the base. A label was affixed to it. "To delay is to decide. Timer ends at 3 p.m. Lestrade stepped. Forward. A bomb? No," Holmes said after a moment. "Not explosive. The box is weighted too lightly. More likely a signal trigger, something meant to activate another device elsewhere." "Then what happens when it strikes 3? I asked. "Something begins," Holmes murmured, "or something ends." He looked around the room again, then strode to the window and flung it open. Across the quay, partially obscured by crates, stood a row of cargo bins, one marked with the logo of Halberd Shipping. Holmes turned sharply to Lestrade. "Check every crate in that stack. Now, look for anything wired, irregular, out of place." The constables moved at once. Within minutes, one of them shouted, "Sir, over here." Holmes and I hurried across. At the base of one container, behind a false panel, sat another metal device larger than the first, fitted with a brass tube and coiled copper wire. Holmes examined it briefly, then stood. Gas dispersal, likely irritant or disabling, enough to empty the dock, disorient anyone nearby. A diversion, Lestrade frowned. But for what? Holmes's face grew hard. For his escape. We stood in silence for a moment. Then, from behind us, dashed footsteps. Quick. Precise. We turned. Finley. He stood not 20 yards away. Rain falling lightly on his coat, his hands in his pockets. He met Holmes's gaze without flinching. "I wondered if you'd come," he said. "You've ruined everything else." "You're not a subtle man, after all," Holmes said calmly. "You always had to time it perfectly, but you left out one variable." Finley tilted his head. "You assumed," Holmes said, stepping forward, "that no one would understand the mechanism faster than you did. That's always been your flaw. You confuse complexity with genius. But I recognized your signature hours ago, behind Finley. 2-yard men appeared, Lestrade's signal having been sent minutes earlier by one of the constables. Finley turned slightly, saw them, and smiled. "No more clocks to run," he said softly. "Pity." He did not resist as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. As he was led away, Holmes stood for a moment by the triggered device. The timer ticked faintly on, counting down toward a moment that would never arrive. His empire was built on delay. Holmes said, on the illusion that time could be bought, borrowed, or withheld. I nodded, and in the end, Holmes said, turning away, it caught up with him. The rain had begun to ease by the time we returned to Baker Street that evening, the cobbled streets slick with water and the gas lamps reflected in long ribbons. Across the paving stones, the warmth of our familiar rooms greeted us like a loyal hound, the fire crackling cheerfully and Mrs. Hudson having prepared a tray with tea, a modest supper, and, at Holmes's request, a fresh newspaper. Holmes shed his damp coat and hat, tossed them over the back of the settee, and stood for a moment before the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I, meanwhile, collapsed into my usual chair, the ache of the past few days finally settling in my limbs. Well, Holmes, I said, it's done. Finlay is behind bars. Chase is facing charges. Rowntree will not see another courtroom for some time. You've dismantled their entire enterprise of delay. Holmes turned his gaze toward me, and though his eyes were sharp, there was a peculiar stillness to him, a contemplative weariness I had not seen since the Moriarty affair. It is not the dismantling that satisfies me, Watson, he said quietly. It is the understanding. Finlay's genius was never in his inventions, it was in identifying the space between events, the gap between act and consequence. He discovered that delay, when precisely timed, could be as potent a weapon as the crime itself. He moved to the desk and opened the newspaper. There, on the second page, was a short column. Attempted disruption at South Dock thwarted by police. Suspect apprehended. The article made only the briefest mention of Finlay's arrest and none of Holmes's name. Holmes folded the paper and set it aside. Let him disappear into obscurity. He will not enjoy it. I smiled. He counted on silence. And yet, in the end, it betrayed him. As it always does, Holmes said. Silence delays, but it never protects. Time moves forward, Watson. With or without us, there was a knock, and Mrs. Hudson entered carrying a letter on a silver tray. A note for you, Mr. Holmes, she said, handing it to him. He opened it and scanned the page. A faint smile touched his lips. From Miss Evelyn. Hartright, he said. She writes to inform us that her uncle's estate has been rightfully secured. The trustees have acknowledged the validity of his revised will. She also enclosed a check entirely unnecessary for our services. I leaned forward. Will you accept it? Holmes shook his head. No. Let her invest it in repairing what Chase and his ilk attempted to destroy. Money born of delay should, perhaps, be used to restore the time it once tried to steal. He returned to his armchair, drew out his pipe, and lit it with deliberate calm. A thin plume of smoke rose toward the ceiling as he leaned back, satisfied at last. And now, he said, let the clocks resume their proper rhythm. I poured the tea, and for a while we sat in a companionable silence. The only sound the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant chime of the Baker Street bells. Marking the hour dot in the days that followed, Finlay's confession came slowly, but fully. Faced with the unshakable web of evidence, He at last surrendered the breadth of his dealings, his methods, his clients, his plans. Many of his associates were exposed, quietly removed from positions of influence. The scandal, while hushed, reverberated through the city's financial and legal circles, a chilling reminder of how easily delay could be weaponized. In the hands of those without conscience, Miss Hartright visited us once more before leaving. For the countryside, she brought with her a basket of early spring flowers and a single line of sincere gratitude, delivered without pretense. Holmes accepted it with a slight bow and said nothing more, though I noticed the flowers remained on the mantel for longer than usual. As for Holmes, he resumed his routine with renewed precision. The case had stirred something in him, a grim recognition, perhaps, that even in a city so full of order and rule, the manipulation of time itself could unmake everything. Yet he faced it not with despair, but with purpose. One evening, as the sun set in gold across the rooftops of London, I asked him whether the case had changed his view of justice. Not justice, he replied, staring into the fire, but urgency. We must never assume that time will wait while we decide what to do. Delay, Watson, is often the ally of evil. He looked at me then with a rare flicker of emotion. And that, he said, is why we must act when the bell rings, not after. And so it ended. The curious case of the alarm that rang a day later, tale not only of murder and misdirection, but of time, consequence, and the quiet tyranny of hesitation. And in the end, it was Sherlock Holmes who rang the final bell on time.